Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Early Excellency's Roundtable. Today we're placing the focus on a discussion around aspects of assessment in the EYFS, and that's in response to some questions that we've been getting through from on social media platforms, but also as part of our ongoing discussions when we're in schools. It's something that's quite prevalent to kind of talk through that people want to unpick. So I'm Sarah Carey and I'm the School Improvement Lead here at Early Excellence. I work a lot on the strategic team, working with heads and school leaders, really looking at school improvement, driving practice, but also quality assuring and reflecting on strengths in early years and Key Stage 1, as well as those next steps. And today I'm joined by Phil and Anna, so I'll let them both introduce themselves and then we'll kind of get started. So over to you, Phil.
Hi, I'm Phil Armstrong. I'm Senior Education Lead at Early Excellence and, like Sarah, part of the strategic team as well. And part of my role is supporting schools and settings predominantly across the south of the UK but further afield, and also part of my role is supporting our international schools as well.
Hi, I'm Anna Caulfield. I'm one of the curriculum consultants here at Early Excellence, and I spend, like the rest of the team, spend a lot of time out and about in schools, supporting schools and delivering training mainly across the southeast of England.
Great, super. So we're coming together today, as I say, to talk about assessment in the early years. Now, we haven't got all of the answers in and we've only got a finite amount of time, but certainly through our work, when we, particularly the three of us, are in school in that school improvement role, I think assessment is a conversation that people are wondering what other people in schools are doing and are curious to know, are they doing the right things? Are they doing enough? Are they doing too much? So lots of conversations around that I think we tend to engage in. And as I say, on our social media platforms, we've had some questions come in, so we'll work through some of those and hopefully provide some really valuable insight for people who are watching and listening today. So in terms of the questions, we've had several come through. So let's start with one that's quite broad and quite open in terms of that question of what should I be looking for when I'm assessing children in the early years? You know, that big, let's open with a big one. So Phil, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I suppose historically there's been a bit of a paradigm shift in assessment in the EYFS, wasn't there? And a few of us can remember not so long ago when we collected mountains and mountains of evidence about how children were in the early years, from thousands of post-it notes to photographs. It was almost evidence by weight, I think, was the situation we were in. And that change in the EYFS encouraged us to really think about what we were gathering and why. But I think it's important that we always remember we're constantly assessing. We tend to think of assessment as something sitting down with a piece of paper or doing something on a computer, but every time we're observing, every time we're interacting, every time we're talking to children's parents and families, it's part of that broader assessment process. Something that I'm always particularly a big fan of is thinking about children's levels of wellbeing and involvement, and how critical it is that we're looking at those as part of a holistic strategy for assessment. Because without having those securely in place for young children, we know that learning in its kind of academic sense is going to be really difficult for them. So many of the schools that we work with, that's the kind of starting point. And then also things like the characteristics of effective learning. I still think they're a bit quiet probably in the current version EYFS, so we're always kind of trumpeting very loud about them, I suppose, because they're going to show us what those children are like as learners. And the more that we can do to discover what they're like as a learner will help us think about how best we can support them in that adult role. So as well as those kind of more traditional curriculum areas, I think it's really thinking about who is this child, how can I support them in the best possible way to be an effective learner, but also thinking about how are they personally, how do they feel being in my setting, are they enjoying the new relationships they're building, are they making friends. I keep going back to thinking about those first conversations with parents and what they always ask, don't they, those first few weeks when children join a school, join nursery, and they say, is my child, are they happy? Are they making friends? Are they being confident? All those sorts of things that I think are innate within us, and we want to see every child having the opportunity to strengthen those, I suppose.
Yeah, I agree. I think they're really crucial start points and sometimes can get forgotten. We know there is an academic focus, but I think those levels of wellbeing and involvement are crucial because they are indicators of the readiness to learn, as you say, and as you say, we do trumpet the characteristics of effective learning, those learning to learn behaviours. But I think that term you used about holistic is vitally important. So even when you're looking at the more academic side of things or the curriculum side of things, actually there still needs to be a holistic viewpoint of that, because of course we know there's that interconnected nature of learning, particularly kind of in the early development stages of how things within those prime areas connect to those specific areas. So I think I would be kind of encouraging encouraging schools to think about the breadth of what they assess without making it unmanageable, but actually not having too tight a lens. I think it's that kind of holistic picture across the curriculum as well. Anna, anything you want to add?
No, I think yeah, definitely agree. I have lots of conversations, particularly around the characteristics of effective learning in schools, and I think I agree, Phil, that there is that kind of danger sometimes that they do get a little bit overlooked, lost. There aren't as many conversations that around them, which I think is really important. But I think it's that whole profile and not forgetting because I think also sometimes our mind is on that end point, and not forgetting that actually, where are we right now? It's about that, that celebration of achievement, that really getting to know our children. And actually, if we are focusing in on the areas of learning and development, then actually what we know is we need a really good understanding. We need those really strong relationships with our children. So we need to know everything about our children in terms of levels of well-being and involvement, characteristics of effective learning, how they learn, what that looks like. So I think it is, Sarah, as you said, it is that holistic picture and making sure that we don't get drawn into that slightly narrow focus, which I think is sometimes a bit of a danger, isn't it?
For sure. And I suppose that kind of leads us on to one of the next questions that's kind of come in around. So what should EYFS teachers and practitioners be assessing against, or what can they use to support as a base for their judgments? What advice would you be giving around that?
Well, shall I start? I suppose drawing on things like the EYFS, obviously, things like Development Matters, Birth to 5 Matters, the original Development from 5 Matters. There are a range of resources to draw on. I think also drawing on the expertise of colleagues, I think is so important, isn't it? I think particularly for less experienced practitioners working in the early years, helping them get that 360 view of learning, so that when they see children engaged in play with the water, they don't just see capacity, so they think, early mathematics. They're seeing all the other things that are taking place at the same time. And I think having those really rich conversations with other colleagues are absolutely critical for that. I love it when you see people really analysing video, photographs and so on, and really thinking about what was happening there. So not only do I understand how children learn, so that kind of strand of child development, but what are these children demonstrating here? What are they learning? But how are they learning as well in that particular context? So yeah, I think kind of those tools, obviously we have the kind of statutory, non-statutory kind of tools to support us. But I think really drawing on colleagues can be really, really powerful, and taking the time to reflect on what they've seen as well. I know that's so difficult. Days are so busy, and finding that time to catch up with each other, but to have conversations about children's learning. In fact, the EYFS encourages us to do that, doesn't it, as part of our assessment processes. So we need to make sure we're having time for that as well.
Absolutely. Anna, you look like you were ready to kind of jump in.
Yeah, just to pick up on what Phil said, I think I do think Development Matters is a really, and it's it is about supporting curriculum development, but it's a really useful tool in terms of building understanding. I think in terms of stages of development, where children are, what they need next, because ultimately when we're thinking about assessment, that's what we're talking about, isn't it? It's about knowing what our children need. So I think I do think as a tool it is really helpful, particularly if you are less familiar with the early years. I think it is a really useful tool.
Yeah, and I mean I would echo that in terms of two things really. It's absolutely is a tool, those non-statutory tools. Birth to 5 and Development Matters, they are curriculum development tools. So they're there to help you develop a progressive, cohesive, cumulative curriculum, but they're also really valuable tools to help us to understand child development and next steps in child development. So I think when we're talking about using them as tools, it's not, to be really clear, it's not about a tick list of I'm going to look at Development Matters and tick off they can do this, this and this. That's not what we're kind of advocating in terms of assessment. We're saying use them as tools to really strengthen your understanding of child development, next steps in child development, so that you're as well placed as possible to stand back and make a judgment if you're making that kind of summative judgment, or when you're actually in the provision with the children, recognising where they are, and to your point, Anna, thinking about, so what do they need next? And if you have over time built that knowledge and understanding of your curriculum and where it's going, the trajectory of travel, but also child development, you're better placed to kind of enable to use that information that you're observing and seeing and hearing to help those kind of next steps. So they're very much tools to build our knowledge, I think, so that we're better placed to make those judgments and make those assessments. Does that make sense?
Completely agree. It's that kind of that adage, isn't it? You can only see what you can see, and therefore you can only understand what you can understand. You can only act on ultimately what you understand as well. And I think, we saw that with regional development matters, didn't we? It got turned very quickly into an assessment tool, which is what it was designed. It was designed to help inform us and to help with our knowledge. And of course, there are those tools that are based around speech and language communication development and so on. We know lots of schools have those, either that being provided through speech and language therapists themselves or through other schemes perhaps that the schools have been accessing. Again, for me, it's always looking and using them carefully and critically and thinking, what's this telling me? And more importantly, what am I going to do with this information is the critical thing, isn't it? So we don't get trapped into that. I'm just gathering lots and lots of evidence, but I'm not really using it. I think that's the critical thing. Everyone's always got to keep asking with any assessment conversation.
And I think that actually that feeds us into one of the other kind of frequently asked questions is around what, if any, evidence should I be collecting? And of course, you mentioned at the start, Phil, that shift that's been taken away from lots and lots of posters and physical evidence to actually, there's no expectation to record anything, in the statutory expectations. But we've not really been led by the hand as teachers and practitioners to get us to that point of not collecting. And equally, I think often when you're kind of talking to heads and school leaders and early years leads, there's still things that some people want. So Anna, you're most recently left headship not so long ago. So what would you be saying in terms of, if any evidence, what should be collected and why, and what are the parameters we need to be thinking about?
I think in a nutshell, actually, what you've just said is it, because it's about the why, isn't it? And, any decisions that we make in terms of evidence, because it was, that lovely moment that was incredibly freeing and fantastic because it brought it right back down to our professional judgment, our professional expertise and professional conversation, which absolutely should be. But I think also there is that shift, and I think particularly as school leaders, lots of questions were then around, but how do I know and how am I secure that judgments are accurate, that I'm absolutely sure. So I think it's about any evidence that you are collecting having a really good reason for that. So what does it show, what new information does it provide that you wouldn't otherwise have as a professional? So I think it's one of those, we obviously get asked that question a lot, and it's one of those, there's no magic answer to that. This is exactly what it should look like. But I think, lots of the conversations and lots of settings, certainly that I've been in, collect some kind of writing evidence, because actually that is quite useful in terms of progression over time and what it demonstrates, because it very clearly demonstrates that. But actually, broadly speaking, rightly or wrongly, I would suggest that much of that should just be about that professional dialogue and feeling really secure, having really robust building a narrative really around your individual children. I think that's, for me, is what it should be, much more than a collection of evidence.
And I think as well we need to be mindful of, if as school leaders, if as early years leaders, if as teachers we're deciding to collect information, really to kind of really reiterate and agree with you, it's about the so what, why do we need to collect this? Do we actually need to physically collect it, or actually have we already made a mental note of that has been internalised, that will help us make our professional judgment? But whatever we are collecting needs to be a true reflection of what the children can do on their own, in a kind of really meaningful context. So it's something that the children have as embedded learning, not a just done. And if we're collecting evidence, being really mindful that it's not taking the staff away from the children for prolonged periods of time. And I know that's a phrase within the statutory framework, but we need to be really clear on that. The shift happened because we know adult interactions makes the most significant difference to learning, language communication and those relationships. So if we're then asking our team to collect evidence, we're almost undoing that very positive step that's been made. So really thinking about it, not taking the staff away from the children for too long, and of course vitally important that it's not really then weighing on workload for staff to be doing it at another point. I think that's so important. So I think that I often have a conversation, a deep discussion, let's say, when I'm in school around evidence that's collected in books, for example, and then really having that, unpicking that conversation of, so does that show what the children can do, or is that showing what's just been taught? Because that's two different things. Is it showing the curriculum in action, or is it showing the embedded learning that the children know? And again, I think we need to be very careful when we're thinking about using evidence to inform our professional judgments, what evidence we're actually looking at, because if it is a school perhaps that's got lots stuck in books because that is the expectation to show the curriculum in action, that doesn't necessarily mean that that piece of learning has become embedded. So we need to be really clear as to why that is happening, and also then if that's embedded learning or if it's not, so what else are we using? And I think that can be a little bit of a pitfall. You're both nodding lots there.
I completely agree. It's that kind of discussion about evidence of coverage or evidence of learning, which are two very different things. And obviously there's been the push over the last few years for increasing involvement of subject leaders, for example, and understanding their breadth of understanding on early years, and this kind of call for more and more evidence of, have you done this, have you done it, have you taught this? But that we know that's not the same as children actually understanding and learning it. It's just, I've done this, I've taught this lesson. It's evidence of teaching, but not necessarily evidence of learning. And yeah, I think we do need to be really careful. Like Anna was saying, often it's writing. We'll see kind of examples of writing. And then it's like thinking about how are you going to capture it in other ways. So are you giving yourself time to sit and talk with the children about their learning, reflecting on their learning? I mean, I love it sometimes when you go into school and there'll be one of those learning journeys up and a child takes you over to have a chat about things they've been learning, and they can quite clearly recall all of those experiences because, as you say, they were meaningful to them, but also they were enthused by them, and they've gone deeply embedded. And of course then you see it in those moments, those interactions, or generally observations as well. So I think there has been a shift. I think we're still finding our way. I remember a few years ago we held an event similar, talking about assessment, and I think people just wanted people to say, yes, you need 3 pieces of evidence for everything, and it's taken us a long way to get back from that, I think, but we're getting there. I think.
Yeah, and I think you're right. Those sorts of, I would always be saying to anybody, whether it's a subject lead, whether it's a school leader visiting their early years, or indeed a class teacher or practitioner really thinking about making those judgments, visiting during provision time and engaging with the children, they will showcase what they know and what they're wobbly with and what they're expert in through those conversations. And actually that example of the learning journey on the wall, or schools that perhaps use floor books effectively for more than just curriculum in action, actually using them as teaching and learning tools, the children will demonstrate what knowledge they can retrieve, what they've remembered, what they've been taught, and kind of model that vocabulary that they perhaps were learning at that time. So that those conversations and interactions with children are a really powerful way of kind of building your knowledge and understanding of what the children can do and what they know. So I think, you know, that sometimes again gets forgotten because it's not you don't get a physical something out of it, but actually by, you know, you can do some of that for quality assuring as well. And I think for some schools, I've been at some schools where every so often they still perhaps video record, capture little moments of children doing things, and they're really interesting to look back on when you look back to earlier in the year to where we are now. That can sometimes show huge amounts of progress. So I think picking up on that phrase that you said, Phil, looking at it in a different way, where we build that picture and where we build that evidence, because it's all about evidence to help us make those informed decisions. It's building that picture, isn't it? Okay, so something that I think we've been reflecting on as a curriculum team quite widely, but questions that come up in school is, so when should I assess? And I guess that's twofold, isn't it? Because there's the assessments, I guess, that we would perhaps potentially call assessment points through the year, but then of course something that you've already said, Phil, really is assessment is ongoing, isn't it? So I feel like we've probably covered off the second part of that. It's ongoing through those interactions, it's ongoing through your questioning, it's ongoing through kind of standing back and observing. But in terms of actually maybe more points in the year, what do you talk about in schools when you're having those sorts of conversations?
I'll let Anna go first.
Yeah, it's interesting again because you know it is a varied picture, and obviously, you know, again, that has definitely changed in recent years. I think, you know, we've seen a big reduction in terms of those kind of fixed assessment points that happen through the year. And I think actually what I think has been really positive is there's much more conversation about the right moment in order for those conversations to be had in order for it to impact what happens next. Because historically it kind of always used to be at the end of a term, you know, and it was almost kind of I think we talked about this earlier a little bit, but it, you know, that actually the assessment happens at the end of a term, it gets put away on a system and never looked at again until a term later when we go, oh goodness, look at this. And I think it has become, even in that kind of summative way, it's become much more of a formative process, I think. So I'm seeing lots of shift into those kind of mid-term points, so where there are those kind of mid-year assessment points, fixed points, they do tend to be much more mid-year, and it is much more about where are we now, how's that going to impact provision and practice moving forward for the remainder of this term, but in an ongoing way, which I think is really positive. But definitely there's been a reduction of those points, and I think for me where it works really well is where they're very much part of those professional conversations, that professional dialogue, that conversation around the children in terms of, you know, what their successes are, but also what they need next. I think it is at every point, you know, we know at the end of the earliest foundation stage we've got a fixed statutory assessment, but actually we need to look at every other point as part of a process of informing our practice, really, and informing what happens for our children, I think.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think obviously that value of think about assessment when children first join us, so we get that baseline in its truest sense, so one that we can actually use and one that's going to make us think about, well, okay, I've set up this provision, but is it actually right for these children? And what has really inspired me over the last few years is people being really brave and really flexible in the way that they've suddenly thought, do you know what, I need to work in a different way because I've observed these children over the first few weeks. I can't work in the way I did with the previous cohorts. I'm going to need to change not only my environment but tweak my curriculum and responding truly to the children's needs. And that's where you get great assessment kind of in action, isn't it, rather than perhaps the current RBA, which is not designed for that kind of purpose. And then it's really thinking about who's going to need me to watch more carefully, who's going to need more effective support, who might need more targeted kind of support, I suppose, really. And that kind of more personalised approach. I've certainly seen a lot more of that over the last few years. Like Anna was saying, a few years ago, it was almost every week people were putting data into a system expecting to see some miracle change. And of course, we know with children, that's not the way it works. First of all, it's not a nice linear progression, but also they don't work in that way. It's not the way we develop it as human beings. So thinking more strategically about when is it going to be useful to know. And obviously at this time of year, we're recording this just before Easter holidays, so we know lots of people have been having conversation about, well, how are the children doing, for example, in reception? And who is it we're going to need to give that extra support for? Because the rest might be okay, but there might be some children that are going to need a bit more. Are there some children who we've been giving a little bit of extra help with physical development or language development? Let's review how that is going. I think there's a bit of a legacy of sometimes with some programmes and some ways of supporting children that we wait till the very end almost, and maybe we need to check in a little bit earlier and think, is this actually working, is it appropriate? So I think a much more personalised and strategic approach rather than what perhaps a computer system I've been saying you must do it these certain dates, and I think the EYFS has given us that flexibility, hasn't it? What I always think is interesting is when we do the profile, there's still quite a way sometimes for some children to go before the end of that summer term. I know it's something we've been talking about a little bit, that kind of gap, and those children who are just actually starting to really, or there's light bulb moments are happening, those connections being made, and they don't always get the credit for it because the data's been submitted and off it goes. And you know, that little window, which we know is so important, particularly for some of our youngest children in reception, for example. So I think a more responsive and strategic approach is definitely what we're seeing more and more of now.
Yeah, and I think you're right. It is that it's sometimes, I think, still for some schools and perhaps schools that are working together, that step away from termly assessment is still one that some schools are wondering whether to take or not to take. And again, it's not about you must or you mustn't do that, but it's about encouraging that reflection of the why, because you don't assess children to find out how well they've done. Actually, what you're doing is you're giving the children all those rich opportunities so that they can progress, and keeping assessing children doesn't enable them to progress, if that makes sense. We've got to use the so what of that information that we're gathering to inform practice and provision. And I think, you know, we've been running a pilot actually this year and through the reception year about assessment, and to pick up again on your point, Anna, one of the things we talked about as part of that pilot is actually a shift away from termly but to more of a mid-year actually. So how are things going? And that has really helped shape those conversations around what you were saying, Phil, which children need what and why, and really focusing in on different children at different points depending on where they are in that journey and how they're moving forward. And of course we know in terms of child development, children do tend to develop in 6 monthly milestones. That doesn't just stop after they, you know, once they've been a baby and turned 1. So really thinking about that and that kind of spacing out. So there's that mid-year sort of feel, or that mid-term sort of feel, but that responsiveness of okay, so these children we've been watching carefully. Do we need to continue to watch them carefully, or are there other children on radar? And again, that takes you back to your professional discussions with colleagues, but using what you know based on that picture that you're building because you're with the children in provision. And I think that's one of the key threads always in all of our conversations, whether it be this or other things. Actually, it's about finding that balance and making sure that as teachers and practitioners, you are regularly spending time engaging with children in provision, indoors and outdoors, to build that real picture of what they know and what they can do, and also to have those moments of, oh my goodness, we've taught that and I really thought they've got it and they've not, and they've not either, and they've not either, so actually I need to go back and kind of adjust that a little bit. So yeah, so I think just encouraging people to reflect on, as you say, the strategic thinking of the strategy behind the assessments and when that's taking place. Interesting, Phil, that you mentioned baseline, because actually one of the questions that's come in is a bit of a, I guess, a bit of a help me out question, really, in terms of what are other people doing to gain a good picture at the start of reception, other than undertaking the RBA, because of course the RBA isn't designed for giving a kind of a starting picture. Actually, we can undertake that, and then that's submitted, and we don't know about that information until those children leave at the end of year 6. So I know there were several questions about that came in across our social media platforms about what are other people doing in almost a help, I need some ideas. So Phil, what would you started talking about baseline, so
well, as you said, a whole range of things. So some people are doing just the RBA, that's all they're doing, the statutory baseline, and then taking some of the statements from it, you know, the short report that you get, and trying to interpret that, even though it's not really designed to help you at that stage, but taking what's been given, I guess. Others are using often kind of a speech and language related tool. I've seen some schools using that. Some people have actually made their own using aspects of the UIFS. But again, we're thinking about those goals, for example, but they're for the end of the UIFS. They're not kind of designed to be looking at that beginning of reception. So there's lots and lots of different models. Some are literally just having a conversation with their teams about where they're at. Some people are using the Leuven scales, looking at wellbeing and involvement. So there's no one size fits all. I know, Sarah, I imagine you're going to talk a little about things we've been doing, but there is, I think the risk is, I guess, that people are doing nothing or not doing anything and then following it up and seeing what it is. So if you are using a speech and language assessment tool, what's that telling you and what are you doing? And it's that kind of, we've gathered the information in and this is where our starting point is. So there's no one model, I guess, is what I'm seeing. I don't know, Anna, if you're seeing the same, I guess.
Yeah, no, definitely, and it is a real mix. And I think, I agree, you know, the danger is, you know, with the RBA, that it's kind of almost well, I've done that, whereas actually, you know, that's not an informing our practice tool. So so there is a real danger in that, but it definitely, you know, from my experience, it is a real mixed bag, definitely.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it takes you back to what the picture that you want to capture at the start of the year when the children join your school, particularly in reception, is about that. So where are they? What are their strengths? And also, what are the next steps? What are their start points? Because, of course, we have conversations about that to kind of look at their progress, to look at their next steps. And at that point, it is about shaping your provision, your practice, your teaching, your learning curriculum around what that tells you. And it's not that you're likely to have to make really significant adjustments, but it is about those fine tunes and kind of responding to that. And I think, you know, for people who are looking at wanting to think about strengthening their on entry processes, it's going back to that conversation we had at the very start of this about it's the why behind why you're doing this, and thinking about that holistic and interconnected picture, and those things that we said around actually wellbeing, involvement, characteristics, and of course those areas of learning as well. So not just keeping it narrow, looking at that big picture, but I think crucially, I sound like a broken record I suppose, but I think crucially, as part of those processes and the practices you have in place, you need to have time with your children. They need to settle. They need to have that settling time. They need to become familiar with their environment. They need to become familiar with you and your adults. You need to build that picture of them. So again, whatever systems and practices you're putting in place, it should really have that at the centre of it. Children settling, getting to know the children, building relationships, vitally important. But drawing on actually the conversations that you're having with parents and carers, maybe with the childminders that have had those children and perhaps continue to have those children. Just because they've started in your school doesn't mean that childminders particularly stop. Thinking about if they've joined from other settings as well, looking at the picture that's been gathered there and kind of using that to help you. So it's not like you're starting from scratch. There's other information there that we should be drawing on and considering as well. And certainly, I mean, Phil, you kind of alluded to work that we've been doing. We've been developing a baseline assessment tool that kind of does look at that holistic picture, but does encourage people to have those conversations as well. But crucially, spend time with the children so that you can see again what's embedded learning and what they really haven't got, and using that to make changes to inform practice, not just to say that's it, mark in the sand, that's where they are. It's always back to that so what, isn't it?
I completely agree, and I think that those transition conversations are a critical part of it. I think really rich and honest and accurate conversations are so important. And because it's the child's journey is just continuing. You know, they're with us either in our class or in our school for a relatively short period of time. So we need to make sure that all those conversations are joined up, and those kind of thinking about how that child has been on their journey through a setting or with a childminder. How are they at home? I think all those voices contributing to that kind of on-entry assessment is absolutely invaluable, and making parents feel truly partners in their children's learning. You know, we value their voice, isn't it? And I think sometimes that might be difficult practically, but I think we need to keep endeavouring to do that, and having repeated conversations with settings, talking about the children. It is a sense of they're yours now, but I think we need to keep that conversation going. I know one of the schools I work with, for example, their reception teacher goes and visits the children in year one every half term to go and see how those children are doing, and to have conversations with the teacher in year one, just to keep the conversation going about progression, learning, assessment, curriculum, all those sorts of things. And that, I remember talking to them about it. It's logistically difficult to manage, obviously time and things, but actually said in terms of impact on children's learning, it's been invaluable, and also professional development for that person as well, in terms of understanding the next bits of the journey as well. But yeah, involving lots of voices would be key.
And I think as well, when you're then looking at the information, the picture that you've captured for individuals or for groups or a class or a cohort, then really thinking about that. We've talked about so what, but then really prioritising the so what, because we know in the early years, and I mean we've talked a lot about reception, but this will go for EYFS generally. Actually, we know there's a drive, you know, in some certain specific areas, but fundamentally we must not forget that the prime areas are prime for a reason. They are time sensitive. So when we've sat back and looked at the picture that we've gathered through our on-entry assessments, whether that is at the start, you know, as the children are joining nursery at the start of a year, start of reception, actually there may well be lots of next steps for them. If we're looking at that holistic view, there may well be a next step in every area of the curriculum and some of the characteristics. But then it's about really using our knowledge and understanding of child development and curriculum, and understanding that big picture to say, so which next step's the priority, which are we tackling first? And I think that's really, really vital, because we know language and communication impacts on so many other aspects of the curriculum. We know that physical development is crucially important, and the window is closing on those prime areas all the time, isn't it? So again, I think it's a conversation to be had more widely when perhaps staff are engaging in. So tell me about your children at the start of the year. Let's look at pupil progress and targets. Really focusing on the right next steps. And of course, if you're looking at that holistic picture, prime areas will come before specific. And that's not to say you won't be teaching those things that you should be teaching in your curriculum, but where you're spotlighting those next steps, I think is really crucial to think about as well.
And that's where that child development knowledge is going to be crucial, isn't it? And that, because the temptation is to let's get them writing, let's get them doing this thing without understanding the foundation for all those things. Yeah, and I couldn't agree more, Sarah. I think it's that what you have to do first is the important bit, and that's where it's incumbent upon anyone who's in senior leadership and supporting colleagues is to make sure that their knowledge of child development and how things join up is absolutely critical. Otherwise, you can look like they've made a lot of progress with writing, but actually things start to fall apart quite quickly because they've not got a strong foundation that things have been built on. And we see that sometimes, don't we? When we historically we look at moderation, and you'd see a child had been given a certain score in one area that wasn't possible because of what they got in another area. And understand that relationship between the areas of learning is absolutely crucial. Yeah.
For sure. So moving on then, we kind of actually now we've touched on this just slightly, but we've got a question around. So what can we use to support our judgments at the end of the reception year? And I'm guessing that question's come in because we're hitting Easter, and of course we're not doing the profile yet. However, that point will come quite soon after Easter in terms of people beginning to gather that evidence. So what's out there to help with making those judgments at that point? Anna, would you want to start us off?
Yeah, I think actually, in terms of what's out there, I think the first resource is actually what's available to you, in your setting. Because I think the first thing for me is that everybody, as we were talking about at the start of that year, having those conversations with everybody. It's about everybody who's involved in that child, because actually it's about feeding in everybody's professional knowledge, and everyone have a little piece of that profile, and that includes, parents, carers, staff within the setting, potentially external professionals if they're working, with children as well. So I think it's about drawing upon everybody's expertise first of all, and then I think also it's about the kind of professional tools. So it's about having a really good understanding, knowing those early learning goals, really knowing them, knowing as we were just talking about, how they're connected to each other, what's going to be dependent on one in terms of achieving in another area. I think it's all those things that we have just talked about, but also then things like the exemplification materials, really useful in terms of reflecting and being secure in terms of the judgments and having those professional conversations. So I think those for me it's utilising everything, isn't it, that's available.
I would agree, yeah. And I think it's also, particularly if it's your first year teaching a particular year group, you don't sometimes have a sense of the journey. So it's like, where would I expect the majority of children to be at this particular point in the year? And that's where drawing on either, and it's particularly difficult if you're in like a one form entry and there isn't another reception teacher there you can speak to. So maybe it's like building those connections, but saying, well, I think they're on track, but what do you think where they should be? And once you've worked in one year group for a little while, you build up that kind of repertoire, don't you? I don't know about yourselves, but I know certainly when I was teaching Key Stage 1, I used to save kind of examples of work across the year and keep them as my own little archive. So every now and again I get the sense of, oh yeah, okay, this is where I would expect them to be. But I think, as you were saying, Anna, it's that conversation. It's talking to lots of people. Where are they at? Having a sense of where the journey is going to be in terms of the goals, but also beyond. There's going to be some of those children who might be demonstrating, very secure in areas already, perhaps because of their age or just the experiences they've had. But then also looking at those children who may be needing more specific support. How are they in their individual targets? So it's quite personalised, I think, in terms of what you use. But professional conversation has always got to kind of be the key, isn't it? And I'd also say for any heads who may be watching this, if early years isn't your natural kind of zone to be in, it's having those conversations either with, maybe you've got a new reception teacher, for them it's new as well. Are there other people you can speak to and say, how do you feel about this? Do you think we're on track? Is this where you'd expect them to be? Talking with your year one colleagues. So all those sorts of things I think can be really helpful, not just for that particular moment in time, but more broadly in professional development, I would say as well.
And Anna, I mean, you mentioned the statutory guidance, it's statutory exemplifications, and of course they're kind of released, and the profile is released each year for people to be working towards and looking at. But I think in terms of those exemplifications, the key messaging is around professional discussion, and I think it's always important to say, actually, in the videos that are kind of put across, those videos really are aesthetics to support having those professional conversations. So for writing, for example, the writing that's being exemplified in those videos is not the standard of writing we're expecting. They are aesthetically, because the conversation behind the dialogue is around writing. That's what those videos are kind of aesthetically showing children writing. But I think it's really important for people who are viewing those and using those to understand what they need to be keying into is the professional discussion, not looking at the videos, because that's very different to the exemplifications of old, where it was presented of, this is what you're looking for. In the instances now, and I can see you both nodding lots, but in the instances now, those videos, the kind of the children's parts of those videos, exemplification videos, are very much about the aesthetics. So making sure that whoever's watching those videos is really tuning into the professional conversations that's taking place. And listening to how the staff are saying, well, I know this because, an example of is because. So again, thinking for yourselves, if you were going to be talking about a child, could you give those examples or similar examples? Can you kind of close your eyes and visualise where you've seen that child doing that embedded piece of learning in different places, so that you can absolutely say, yes, they're secure in that. So it's reflecting on the conversations that are taking place, putting yourselves in that place, as it were, thinking of children in your class and thinking about the examples, the examples that you would be giving that you've seen from when you've been in the provision with the children. Good. So we've talked a lot about kind of reception. That seems to be a lot of the questions, but something that's come in, and I think probably more coming through as we know schools are going through an expansion in terms of their nursery offer, and we've got kind of some schools expanding their nursery offer already, maybe having 3 to 4s but just increasing numbers. Some are introducing 3 to 4 for the first time. Some schools are looking at 2-year-old provision as well. So there's a question really around actually advice for looking at the younger phases in EYFS, so the 2 to 3 or the 3 to 4. Have we got any advice around that? I mean, of course we would still talk around well-being, involvement and characteristics and that holistic picture. I think, you know, that's a rationale that we would kind of be encouraging, but actually anything that we want to layer in for those younger children, anything that we would be saying around that. Phil, do you want to go first on that?
Yeah, so the 2-year-old developmental check, making sure those sorts of things are taking place, and then if you've got 3 and 4-year-olds, referring to that. And what we know that it's required but maybe not always happening, so I'll be checking in and seeing what's happened there. Again, back to those conversations with parents as well, using the frameworks like Development Matters, Bird-to-Five Matters, again, can be helpful through that lens that the curriculum document, but still you can get the sense of what's the journey like for these children, and referring to the original Development Matters as well, I think is helpful. Conversations with wider professionals as well, so if there's any kind of family workers involved, if they're being connected with family hubs perhaps. So again, it's that richest picture as possible really, but always bearing in mind where we think these children are going to be in terms of their age, and thinking about those prime areas particularly, we know is absolutely essential. I think it is something that any school that's expanding its early years provision, they really need to make sure that the adults working in that space have got secure child development knowledge of working with that particular age group, because it can feel very attractive. I love working with 2-year-olds, absolutely love working with 2-year-olds, but you need to make sure you've got people in that environment who are really skillful at interpreting those 2-year-olds and thinking, right, what is it I can do next to support them? But in terms of tools, yeah, you obviously, as I said, child development, 2-year-old check is probably the main one you draw people towards. But I think what's lost perhaps is a connection with wider agencies like health, and maybe exploring those opportunities as well. The rare situation where some schools have still got children's centres, using those kind of connections as well, I think that's what we're looking at. So lots of possibilities.
Anna, anything you want to add?
No, I think, as you started off really by saying, Sarah, I think, the underpinning principles are the same, aren't they? It's about, and as you said, Phil, that secure understanding of child development, knowing, what's next for our children, what they need and what we need to be doing in order to support them effectively. And I think, that looks the same, doesn't it? It's just,
Yeah. And again, spotlighting those prime areas. So whilst you will be looking at all areas of curriculum, those next steps, particularly I would be saying for the younger children, prime areas will absolutely be fundamentally their next steps, even if there's other things that we know they need to do in other areas. Fundamentally, prime areas need to be that real focus. And you touched on it there, Phil, in terms of developmentally age. It's almost ages and stages, isn't it? That we're kind of looking at and thinking about. Not markers in the sand, but we know children have had. For our younger children in whatever cohort, whether it's 2-year-old, 3-year-old or reception, for the younger children in that cohort, for example, they've had nearly a whole year's less life experience on this planet. So for a 2-year-old, that's almost 50% less, isn't it, because of their whole life. So I think, again, really thinking about, to reiterate, it is child development and ages and stages that kind of are quite crucial at those points as well, I think, and looking at those prime areas.
And I think within, if you think about individual development matters, where it almost gives you those hot spots and moments to look out for and say, are we seeing this with these children? If we're not, do we need just to be more conscious of observing and thinking about, is it the provision? Is it the relationships, or is it something this child needs in terms of additional support? But I think we know particularly that 2-year-old point in a child's life is so critical. So that's why I always think it's really incumbent upon us all to make sure whoever is connecting with those 2-year-olds is really skilled and knowledged in working with that particular age group. When we think about things like attachment and so on, it's absolutely critical. And as schools start to expand their early years provision, even more important that we make sure that all the best people are working with that age group.
So we're going to flip to the other side for like the kind of closing of the session, last few questions, really around year one, and kind of assessing and informing year one, because of course we know the EYFS statutory framework, the profile is very much about supporting transition, and that process, as you've alluded to, Phil, actually that process happens quite early in the summer term really, and there's still teaching and learning taking place. And I know the pilot that we've been running, alongside the baseline, we've been exploring other things through the reception year, and we are exploring, okay, so how does that look at more towards the end of the year and making that manageable for staff. But there's a question around, so how much should year one staff be involved in assessments and understanding those assessments at the end of reception? So I guess it could be profile, or if the schools are doing other things as well. So what are our thoughts on year one staff getting involved?
I think as much as possible is the is the first thing I'd say. I think what's really nice is more and more when I'm in schools, those conversations are being had much more regularly, much more consistently than maybe historically they might have been. And I do think, in some ways that kind of shift in the kind of the needs of our children coming through in our schools, what we're seeing in terms of child development moving through, I think people are almost kind of feeling like actually we need to be having those conversations really early. We need to look at what that provision looks like for our children in year one. And I think it's for me it's really pleasing to hear those conversations being had much more consistently and much more regularly. But I think ultimately it is, we know what the challenges are in terms of finding the time and the space for those professional conversations to be had, but I think it's absolutely essential that those conversations, and right now those conversations are being had right the way through this term, feeding into planning for provision. What will those children need when they join our year one cohort? And we know we have lots of conversations around child development and what our young children need at that age. And so the most valuable conversations is with our early years teams in terms of moving that provision forward and really kind of unpicking that. So I think, as much as possible, as many as possible conversations, professional conversations, and as early as possible as well, I think is really valuable to inform practice. And again, it does go back to what we were talking about right at the start, which is the whole purpose of assessment is about informing what happens next for our children. So otherwise, you know, we run the risk of it being that, you know, you talk about it a lot, Phil, but that cliff edge from reception
absolutely.
through into year one.
And I think you've already mentioned, Phil, about there's a school that you work with where the reception teacher goes on into year one and touches base with year one, you know, after those children have left reception, but there's that ongoing conversation. But again, I think it's almost looking at some of those transition processes, dare I say. We know we always talk about transition not being an event and actually things happening through the year, but to really strengthen those professional conversations, Anna, it is about your year one team understanding EYFS, visiting at points through the year. So it's not just about coming down for a story time or them coming and visiting the classroom. Actually, just as we've said, when you're building that picture of the children to assess and inform your professional judgment, actually year one staff visiting and seeing provision happening, visiting during provision and engaging in the children, looking at those floor books, looking at those photos, engaging with what the children are doing, listening to what those children are saying, showing, demonstrating, will give those year one teachers a greater flavour of what the children can know and retrieve and can do, and, you know, within the right enabling environment can really showcase. So again, I think to help those year one staff to engage in the professional conversations, again, you're kind of back to some CPD potentially of them understanding, seeing learning, and seeing how that can happen in a purposeful atmosphere, and understanding a member of reception, the reception team is saying, I'm making this judgment because, and actually the year one receiving teacher being able to say, yes, and I've seen them do that too in this instance and this instance before they've even joined. And again, we haven't got a magic wand on time, we haven't got a magic wand on class cover and all of those sorts of things, but we're talking, you know, if we can make inroads into that in some way, really thinking about how that will then help that member of staff as they receive those children to continue the learning journey in a more seamless way, so that the children are best placed to be able to continue to showcase what they know, rather than thinking this all looks different and feels different, it must all be new and I don't know anything, and actually that can kind of cause barriers, as you say, that cliff face, as it were. So
I completely agree with what you both said. I think we need to smooth things over. At the moment, it's all very dramatic, the end of each year, and it's almost like we start all over again. And I think any conversation, I always feel really privileged when I was first school I worked in, and the local authority managed to find some money, I don't know where from, but they used to set up these meetings where reception teachers and year one teachers would get together out of school and go through all of the children. And it was invaluable, absolutely invaluable from both perspectives. Because ultimately it saves you time, because you're not having to restart all over again and rethink, and ultimately therefore it has to be better for the children. It has to, you know, the outcomes have to be better. And I think there has been much more connection, I think, as you were saying, Anna, between particularly year one reception. I think those bonds have become much stronger than ever. There was always a little bit of, you know, there's Key Stage 1, there's early years, and I think things, because of the way that children's needs have changed and evolved, and we're finally recognising that in schools. So the more opportunities you say, Sarah, the better. And it's there in the EYFS. It says that's what we should be doing. You know, they should be involved when we're having conversations about children who aren't making expected levels of development, achieving those GLD. We need to have that conversation. So we're required to do it in a statutory way. Finding time is not always easy, but we have to. I think it's the thing. We can't afford not to, I suppose.
No, I think it's interesting as well. I mean, as I say, we're slightly, because we're talking, the question was around year one, so we're slightly talking more about transition elements. But I also think it's interesting when you, if you've been involved in those transition conversations, if there is a staff meeting, for example, which is quite traditionally and typical, there's a staff meeting allocated where the year one and reception teacher meet and talk through the children. I'm always interested to know what shapes that conversation and where it starts with, because again, for us, I will be starting with characteristics of effective learning and well-being and the things that interest them and where they learn most effectively and those sorts of things, whereas more often than not it's about they're here in specific academic areas and this is what they haven't got and this is what they need next, which absolutely has its place, but actually the bigger, back to that bigger holistic picture, I think is quite telling in terms of what people perhaps have professional conversations about. So that almost takes us full circle to, in terms of assessment, it's very much being clear in your why, your rationale for assessment, why, and actually the goal. We talk a lot about golden threads that run through our vision and values for our school or for our early years or for our Key Stage 1, but there also needs to be an essence of that, I think, through your vision and values for assessment. And it is the so what. What's next, what's going to make a difference, which children need what and why, and actually what do we hold as important. And for us, we would be saying characteristics, well-being, and the interconnected nature. But again, I think sometimes assessment becomes a we've got to get this done, and that's not what assessment is for. And I think, you know, that's a big message, isn't it, really? So is there anything else either of you would like to add in the kind of conversation around assessment? We've answered lots of the questions that have come into us, but if there was any kind of sum up sentence that you would want to say, I guess I've kind of just done mine in terms of that vision and values, but any other kind of sum up sentence that you would want to say around assessment in the early years, kind of now's your moment. Over to you, Anna, throw you in there.
Thanks. I think actually for me it is that going back to, you know, everyone being involved in it in order to build a complete holistic picture of the children in order that it informs what happens next. I think that would be my sum up.
Lovely. Phil?
Yeah, I would completely agree. And I think also thinking from school leadership perspectives, from head teacher particularly, if you're not feeling as confident in those kind of conversations, draw on the resources of people who are more experienced, because you need to be part of that conversation as well. Don't always just look for the data. Have the conversation would be my message.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, I hope people who are watching and listening have found that a useful conversation to listen in on. Hopefully some things have resonated with you, and maybe there's some things that you perhaps want to go back and discuss with your wider team, or maybe with your leadership team. And of course, we always say if there's things that you want to find out about, if you've got questions, then please do reach out and be in touch with us, or do have a look at our website. There's lots of things on there, useful tools, school leader reflection tools around assessment and moderation, plenty out there, and we're very more than happy to be having conversations, so please do get in touch. But thank you, Anna, and thank you, Phil, for your time today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Have a lovely rest of the day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.